Next up, we have Ben Ilegbodu. And I have a fun fact here about Ben. And that is that he used to build games and math programs on the TI-83 calculator in high school. Yeah. Sweet. I didn't have one of those. All I had was one of those gray brick Game Boys that I saved up for with my allowance. Those were less programmable, but could you imagine how much fun it would have been if every kid could have programmed their own Game Boy game? That was my dream. Unfortunately, I didn't get to live that dream. That said, today, Ben is going to talk to us about Next.js and different rendering, server, client, server side, client side, dark side, etc. This will not turn into an RSC flame war, so if you've got your phone out and you're getting on Twitter to start slamming, it's not that kind of a talk. Sit back, relax, and have fun.
All right. Thank you, thank you. Yes, so this is called 50 Shades of Rendering with Next.js. I'm gonna go through all kinds of different ones, already highlighted some of them. So quick question before we get started. Who here develops in React? Raise your hand. Okay, most of us, all right. Keep your hand up if you've used Next.js before. All right, so good, maybe 50 or so percent. So I've been using Next for several years now, and I got really interested in understanding how it all worked, right? So this talk is basically a distillation of what I've learned over the years. So before I get started, I'll let you know that the slides for this are already online, so you don't have to feverishly type or if that's what you are used to. You can use this QR code here. You can go to my website, benmvp.com, and the slides are there. I tweeted out a link to them, so you can find the link there at benmvp on my Twitter. So there's all kinds of different places where you can find it that way. So when React burst on the scene in around early 2015 or so, it was a huge game changer for lots of different reasons. At the time, other UI libraries, when they were running, they would attach directly to the DOM. So everything operated on the DOM. Think of jQuery, Backbone, all those sorts of libraries back then. But React, when it came out, on the other hand, separated the UI from the rendering. So now we could render in all kinds of different environments there. So React Native, for instance, it's able to render in the mobile space because of the separation. We have like Netflix and other streaming services, they're able to leverage React as well because they've built proprietary renderers for TV devices. So this example here, though, is the one that's most common, most popular one that you've probably seen is the renderer for the DOM. So we render out a UI and then develop a UI and then render it out to the DOM. So Next.js capitalized on this separation, right, with the ability to render a React tree to a string. So not to the DOM, but to a string, and then leverage that for server-side rendering. So this began the huge craze of what was called isomorphic React, where we can render the same UI on the server as we do within the browser. So Next actually started way back in like 2016 or so, mainly doing server-side rendering in the very beginning. It was created by Guillermo Rauch, the Vercel founder, but back then it was actually called Zeet, I believe is how it's pronounced. So this is a simplified version of how server-side rendering works. The UI is rendered in React. The server returns that string with the server response, and then it's hydrated on the client to add event handlers and such. So around Next 9, I will say, around 2019, 2020, something around there, Next started emphasizing pre-rendering, so rendering a page at build time instead of at server time. So ever since then, Next has been adding more and more functionality and allowing us more different ways to render our pages. So I want to take the remaining time that we have and go through some of those popular rendering strategies right now. But before we do that, can I get everyone to stand up? Yes. So it's early in the morning, right? We're still, haven't finished our coffee. I'm pretty sure I saw somebody in the front row yawning already, 3 minutes into my talk. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do 10 squats just like this, okay? All right, and if you don't wanna do it, that's perfectly fine. You could just move your hands, but opportunity for us to have fun, okay? I'll count us out. Here we go. Ready? 1, 2, some people are doing real squats. 3, 4, yep, we're doing it. 5, 6, keep going. 7, are you tired like me? 8, 9, and 10. Great job, everyone. Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, let me introduce myself formally. My name is Ben Ilegbodu. Ben Ilegbodu, I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father. Here is my family. That's my wife, Rashida. And our oldest daughter is Simone. She has the glasses on. Our middle daughter, Avery, is there. And then our son, Asher, who never likes taking pictures, like ever. All right, and you can tell right there. We live in a city outside of Houston, Texas called Manville. And my wife actually came with me here to Seattle. We came a couple of days earlier to celebrate our anniversary, in fact. So we've been married 13 years. Oh, thanks. She's actually here in the building. I won't point her out, otherwise she'll be mad at me, and then that'll be the end of our marriage. But you may see her around. You can play Where's Waldo and see if you can find her there. So like I said, we came a little bit earlier. Yesterday we went on this boating tour or whatever with like 60 other people, and the captain actually let me steer the ship. And I was steering it for like 30 minutes, and I even like docked it and everything, had to go around the ship. It was pretty, I was impressed with myself. I don't know, this seems impressive to me. So I'm also a Google developer expert in web technologies, and I currently work at Stitch Fix. I'm a front-end architect there, working on lots of development platforms, which is why I've been studying a lot about Next.js. So for all of you who maybe are not familiar with Stitch Fix, it's an online shopping platform. We combine data science and technology and combine it with a real human stylist, and we'll pick out clothes for you and send it to you whenever you would like. But okay, enough about me. Let me go into what we're talking about. So here is a fictitious product details page for our made up e-commerce site, let's say. So it's got the title at the top, it's got a price, it has the pictures, images for the product. It's got that size selector, which some of them may or may not be out of stock, right? It's got an add to cart button, which may be disabled for various reasons. And there's a header at the top, and then a footer you can't see, but it's there as well. And we've got some recommended products that we could also look at. So I want us to keep this product page in mind, because we're going to talk about the different rendering strategies with this. Oh, and one other thing here is that Next uses what's called page-based routing, or path-based routing, rather. So if we want a page at /product/Acme hoodie, then we're going to put our TypeScript React component at source/pages/product there in that folder. And since it also uses dynamic path routing, then we put it in brackets. Bracket ID is how we can say that any ID can be, this page will serve any ID there. So let's get started. All right, so the first one I want to talk about is what's called client-side routing, or CSR. So it's probably the most popular type of rendering. If you've ever used Create React app, it's client-side rendering and such. So within our React page component, remember it's at source, pages, product, bracket ID. The default export is the page component. So we write our component, we can name it whatever we want, but the default export is the page. And then for our product details page, Next will render a minimal HTML page. So in this case, when there is no data yet, we'll render some kind of loading state there. And then from the URL, it'll grab the ID. So here it's going to be Acme Hoodie, right, from our URL. And it puts that ID into the query object that it gets from Next.js's built-in router. Then after that, right, we'll make a API call to the product API inside of the use effect. So all of this is happening in the browser. And then finally, React will render out the page directly in the browser. So everything is happening there. But here's the thing, right? So since the API is being called on every request, every time it renders on the page, the data could be constantly changing. The size availability status could be changing. The product images could be changing. It could also go on sale. Any of the related products, the header could have a logged in status with my picture, whatever the case is. And the thing is that that new data will be reflected every time that the page is rendered. So it gives us the most up-to-date state. So CSR is great for dynamic content that's changing all of the time. And actually, since the initial page that we get is relatively blank or has a small loading state, the response is actually really fast. So you go to the page, you get something back, and then everything starts rendering. However, because stuff is rendered in the browser render times are really slow because it's got to make that API request, get back the data, then start rendering in the browser. And if you have a low-end mobile device, for instance, or a memory-constrained device, then that rendering will be even slower. And SEO in general is worse too because there's nothing in the HTML. Some crawlers can execute JavaScript, but there's no guarantee there. And you can't put it really in a CDN because there's no HTML to really put there. So CSR works great. Well, it could totally work for this PDP, honestly. And many sites do use CSR or client-side rendering for pages like this. But personally, I wouldn't use it. SEO is too important. We want this thing to render really fast as well. So instead, CSR is great for like highly interactive UIs, right? Think of something like Figma or a task editor like Asana or things like that. Or if your page is mostly third-party widgets, like say a Stripe checkout widget or something like that, then CSR is great for that because it inherently depends on the browser there. So that was CSR. Let's talk about probably what's the most prevalent types of rendering, right? Which is server-side rendering. You probably also have heard of SSR or dynamic rendering, for instance. So the way that we render server-side is by exporting another function called get server-side props. And just like that, our component is server-side rendering. So for this product details page, instead of retrieving the data in the browser, it retrieves it on the node server, the running server there. So for this dynamic route, the ID now is in the params context. So not in the router, but in the params context. And then using the props, data returned by get server-side props right at the end, Next will pass that data that we returned over as props to our component function there. And then the server will then render out the page however we describe using those props. And since the server won't render until the API is done, we don't have to have a loading state because the data is already there. And then similar to client-side rendering, SSR calls that API and renders the HTML on every single request. So no matter who's making the request, how many times, it's always going to make that API request, get the latest data, and then render out. So in fact, on this page, the server could also get the related products data and render out that UI all in the initial render of the page. So similar to client-side rendering, SSR is great for dynamic content, like I said, because it renders on every request. And because the UI returned is the full HTML, it's very SEO friendly, right? Because it has all of the markup. A crawler can see the title, all of the product images, and things like that. And also browser render times are really fast because all of the HTML is there, so it doesn't have to do any extra rendering there. But all of that comes at a cost. And that cost is server response time, because now we're making an API request first on the server, then rendering the HTML. The HTML rendering on the server is probably fast because our servers are fast, but it still takes some time. It's gated by the speed of our API request. So if our PDP had a lot of changing data, like the price and the size availability and things like that were constantly changing, like every 5 seconds, every 2 seconds, who knows, then SSR could be a really good fit. But if the data rarely changes, then server-side rendering is probably overkill and not the best user experience for our clients. So I would say in general, SSR is good for 2 cases, right? So one, like I said, when you have data that's changing often, and then 2, if the data is really user specific, right? So every given user, everybody in here would get a slightly different product page or a slightly different page in general, and server-side rendering is great for that. So you can think of like search results pages or a checkout flow, right? Those are all going to be tailored to you. They're all going to be different every time you render. So those would be great for server-side rendering. Okay, now let's talk about static site generation, all right? So SSG became really popular, let's say 2018, 2019 or so, when Gatsby really popularized it. It existed earlier than that, but it really became something that everybody wanted to do then, mainly because serving a static site was really, really fast. And Next.js, a year or so later, joined the party by making all of its pages static by default. So with static site generating, HTML pages are now pre-rendered at build time. So you run next build and all of the HTML pages are generated then. And that same HTML that was pre-rendered is used for all requests. So not just for you as a client, but all clients that come to the site. So then for a dynamic page like our PDP, right? Remember it's at source/pages/product/bracket ID. The page first needs to export a get static paths function. And its sole goal is to tell Next, well, how many pages, what are the pages that it needs to pre-render. So instead of calling the product API with the given product ID, we call the products API to get all of the products, all right? And then that list of products is massaged and we can do array mapping to be, fancy and such. And we return the paths from get static paths. So if we had 100 products, then we would return 100 paths, all right? FYI, the fallback false here is meant to tell Next that if a page that was not pre-built is requested, then it's a 404, all right? So Acme Hoodie, the name of our product, needs to be one of the 100 that were pre-rendered, because if it wasn't, 404. So only paths that were returned from get static paths will actually work there. But alternatively, get static's pass could return fallback true. And the difference there is that it means that even if a page wasn't pre-rendered, right, it could still be requested. And what will happen when that request comes is that Next won't have the page server side. It won't be cached on the server. So it will show a fallback UI while in the background it's pre-rendering that page. Then it will serve that page and then cache that page, so subsequent requests to that page will now be fast again. And again, it uses the same HTML for everybody. So we can use this fallback strategy to speed up our builds. So let's say instead of 100 pages, we have thousands of pages. Pre-rendering all of those at build time in CI or what have you would take forever, right? And we don't want to have that iterative cycle every time you make a commit that we have to go through those 1,000 pages. So what we can do instead is pre-render the top 100 or the top 500 or however many we want. And then the rest of the pages will be rendered on demand and then cached that way. So when Next is pre-rendering at build time now, it takes those IDs, remember that we returned as pass, and it calls get static props for every one of them. So it iteratively goes through in order to build the page. So this is where now our product page component requests from the API the data for that one product again. So it's still happening in Node, it's not happening in the browser, but it's also not happening on the running server, it's happening at build time. So, but just like with get server-side props, the data is returned back from get static props. And that becomes the props that are then used passed to the product page component. And then lastly, just like before, those props, they're used to render out the HTML page, and then it's stored on the file system at build time. So that when the server runs, then it just goes to the file system and returns them. So the appeal, like I said in the beginning of SSG, is that it's super fast, right? The HTML is pre-rendered before the server even starts, so it doesn't have to worry about generating them on the fly. In fact, that HTML can be cached in a CDN, so placed closer to where the clients are so that it's even faster. But the flip side of that is that build times are slower, right? So you have to take that into account. However, just like server-side rendering, static site generating is fast because, or no, it's SEO friendly rather because all of the HTML is there. But dynamic data can be tricky, right? Because it's pre-rendered, it has all the data there. So if the data is changing, that can be a challenge. Now we could always, on the browser, make API calls to get the latest data, but then we would be losing some of the static key goodness that's happening, right? So it takes a lot of planning and forethought to figure out what part of the UI should be static and what part of the UI should be dynamic. So for this particular PDP that we've been talking about, if we wanted to use SSG for that, what I would do is render out the page with static content, like the whole page with the UI. And then the browser can retrieve whatever we feel like is super dynamic, like the price or the size selector that way. So you have the default state, and then you will update it with the most up-to-date data. So then we could enable the checkout button and things like that, retrieve the related products there. So the pattern basically is with the dynamic stuff, static rendering, and then dynamic overriding in a sense. But in general, I would say that SSG is better for logged out experiences, I will say, where the page can be the same for every user. So I would say like marketing landing pages maybe that are static content, blog posts, those sorts of things, help topics that aren't changing. And even our product page or product listings could work if they don't change often. All right, so we've talked about CSR, right? We talked about SSR. We just talked about SSG. Let me confuse you by giving you one more acronym, okay? And that's ISR. And what it does really is build on top of SSG to try to make it, give it power, basically. And that's incremental static regeneration. So it brings the server back to the party here. So it's basically the same as SSG, right? We have the same get static paths. We have the same get static props, but the difference is this revalidate property that we also return from get static props. And basically what it tells it is it provides a cache time for our static HTML. And when that cache time is up, then Next will regenerate the HTML page. That's where the fancy term comes from. So the page still is static, like everybody who comes and requests the page will get the same page, but it's not permanently static. It actually can be changed without triggering a rebuild. So we can combine revalidate with the third and final option for fallback, which is blocking. And blocking provides a different experience to the user. So if you remember, false meant that if the page wasn't pre-built, that you would get a 404. And true meant that if the page wasn't rebuilt, you would get the loading state until it was built. Well, blocking, the difference between blocking and true is that the client wouldn't get a fallback UI. Instead, the UI wouldn't even update until the HTML has been generated. So you'll click on a link or go to a page, it'll wait, and then return the content. So it's a lot like server-side rendering in that you wait until the page is returned, but still kind of like static site generating. So it's kind of a hybrid of the two because it'll get cached, but it will be there. So Vercel calls it dynamic at the speed of static. So ISR has the same advantages and disadvantages as SSG. The huge difference is that it can update without needing a rebuild, which creates faster UX there. So it's great for pages that need to be the same for everybody, but are also updated regularly. I'm thinking of like headless CMS pages that you don't want engineering to have to continue to make changes to it, and they can make the changes through the CMS, or semi-static pages or listings. So, as I wrap up, I just wanted to highlight all the different rendering ones we've just talked about, recap it. So Next isn't just a static site generator like Gatsby. It's not a CSR renderer like Create React App. It's not even just the SSR renderer like OG Next, right? It's all of them. And the beauty is that any given page can use any rendering strategy there. So I just showed the most popular 4 of them, but we can combine different strategies together, have different configurations in order to create endless combinations. So maybe your login page, your blog post is static site generated. Maybe your product details page or landing pages are using ISR because they need to update on a cadence. Your search results page, checkout, can be server-side rendered, and then lastly, you could use client-side rendering for a page that has third-party widgets, maybe your shipping tracking page that is all rendered in the browser. So I just gave you a whole bunch of information, just flooded you with it, and just in about 25 minutes, right? So here are some resources. If you get the slides, you can click through all those links. The first link there at the top is actually a blog post I wrote about this a couple years ago there. And the rest of them are just docs on Next site about how to do the different strategies. So just wrapping up, I would encourage you to give Next.js a try for those of you who hadn't yet. And for those of you who have, I would suggest you go back, do an audit of your site, make sure you're using the right strategies to maximize your user experience there. So I'll be around for the remainder of the conference if you got little questions here or there, or you can ask me questions on Twitter. And with that, thank you very much.